chapter 4 starts out with a quotation by Adam Smith. It says, "The division of labor from which so many advantages are derived is not originally the effect of any human wisdom, which foresees and intends that general opulence to which it gives occasion. It is necessary, though very slow and gradual consequence of a certain propensity in human nature, the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another." And why is that important for this particular chapter? Well, we've talked about supply and demand, how people go into the market, exchange things for their benefit, but sometimes, for whatever reason, the government decides to get involved in markets, and it interferes with this certain propensity in human nature, the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. And the chapter talks about, the ways that people try to get around these government interventions. That's why that's important for this particular chapter. The chapter talks about price controls. One type of price control is a price ceiling, and it tells you what that is on page 71. The legally established maximum price sellers can charge for a good or resource. And we'll look and see what a problem might be with a price ceiling. This graph is on page 71 if you're having trouble seeing it on the document camera. But we have this graph, and it looks a lot like the other graphs that we've seen so far with supply and demand. The equilibrium price would be E sub O, and the equilibrium quantity would be straight down here. What's the difference here, though? Well, for whatever reason, the government didn't like the price that was being determined out in the market. Probably one of their constituents didn't like the price that they were seeing out in the market, and so they went and lobbied their congressman and said, "You've got to do something about this price." And they did. They put a price ceiling in place. Unfortunately, there's unintended consequences to that price ceiling. It would be great if they could just legislate prices to be low and us all still get everything that we want. But that's not the case. They can set a price ceiling, but can they make somebody sell you something? No. They can't make a supplier supply, can they? No. So, if you put a price ceiling in place, if you look at the supply curve, is it nearly as high as the demand curve at this price down here, P sub 1, where they put in the price ceiling? No. The supply, Q sub S, is much smaller than Q sub D. So, if the supply is less than the demand, what can we say about that market? What situation do we have? A shortage. It tells you right there on the graph, doesn't it? Yeah. We have a shortage here because the supply is less than the demand. And so what might happen? Well, people want to buy this, but they can't. There's producers willing to sell it. There's buyers willing to buy it. But what happened? Well, the government said no. Even though somebody wants to buy it, even though somebody wants to sell it, the government said, no, we're not going to allow you to sell it at that price. Even though, if you look at this, all the way up until this quantity here, in that price, would there be consumer and producer surplus we talked about last time? Yeah, there'd be consumer and producer surplus all the way up to this point here. Yet, what did government say? No, you can't buy and sell at that price. We're not going to let you. And so, you would be hard-pressed to find an economist who would support a price ceiling for that simple reason that it produces a deadweight loss, and you leave consumer surplus and producer surplus just uncaptured out there. So it would increase the surplus value if you were to go ahead and have those transactions. There's an applications and economics section, the imposition of price ceilings after hurricanes. That'll be the last thing we come to in class this morning. So we'll come back to that, and I've got a video that goes along with that. So what's a good example of a price ceiling? Well, one example would be rent control. That usually happens in big cities. We'll watch a video about that this morning also. What's it lead to? Well, it leads to shortages. People who want apartments and are willing to pay for apartments, they can't get them because nobody's willing to supply them at the price of the rent control. And so shortages appear, and then underground markets develop. So earlier I told you that what's the importance of this quotation by Smith? People have a propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. Well, they have that propensity even if the government tells them no. They'll find out, they'll figure out some way to make exchanges usually. So, number two, the future supply of rental housing will decline. Well, if you had a choice between building an apartment building in Dallas that has no rent controls or going to a city who has rent controls, which one would you pick? You'd go to Dallas or one of the other cities that has no rent controls, right? Why build where the government tells you the maximum price that you can charge? So would you be willing to build under those circumstances? No, not when there's other cities that you can go to, right? Number three, the quality of rental housing will deteriorate, and it shows you a picture on page 74. The video I'm going to show you in just a minute has other pictures. It doesn't look like there's been any upkeep made on this place, does it? But if the government's telling you the maximum rent that you can charge, are you likely to go out and make a lot of repairs, be responsive to your tenants? Probably not. Number four, non-price methods of rationing will become more important. Number five, inefficient use of housing space will result. And in the video you'll watch in a minute, you'll see Walter Williams tell you that something along the lines of short of aerial bombardment, that one of the fastest ways to destroy a city is rent controls. So let's watch that video, and then we'll come back and tackle price floors.
Hello, Manhattan Apartments. I have called every realtor in the entire city. Everything else that I saw is horrible. It doesn't even have a sink.
Finding a place to live is always tense, but in many places, politicians have done something that makes it tougher. Normally, when you rent an apartment or house, it costs what it costs because of simple supply and demand. When demand is high, investors see a chance to make a profit. They build more housing. Then supply increases, runs ahead of demand, and prices come back down. The result is affordable housing. That's how it usually works. But in some 200 American cities, politicians, to protect poor people, passed laws that control rents, limit increases. But it so often happens, laws that try to protect us from cruelties of the market have unintended side effects. Look at what's happened here in the city where I live. This is some of New York's most valuable real estate. Does this look like an area that needs to be protected from market cruelties? If you could find a Fifth Avenue apartment on a floor this high with this spectacular view, the rent would be more than $10,000 a month. Alistair Cook has this view. Remember him from Masterpiece Theater?
Good evening. I'm Alistair Cook.
Cook lives at a large apartment on the top floor of this building. But he doesn't pay the $10,000 a month you'd have to pay. He pays less than a fifth that. Wouldn't you like to pay less than a fifth of your rent or your mortgage? Cook pays less because he scored. He was lucky enough to live in this fashionable building at a time when politicians, to help poor people, regulated the rents.
I think he's a thief.
Economist Walter Williams.
A thief? Yes, he's using government to take what belongs to one person and give it to him. That is, if there were no rent control, he would have to pay the market price. But he's not paying the market price.
But he's not breaking any laws.
But laws don't establish morality.
Now, Cook didn't ask for any special breaks. The system just gives it. Remember the Mayflower Madam? Sidney Biddle Barrows made lots of money running a brothel. She pays about half what you'd have to pay for her apartment. Lots of politicians, rich businessmen, and celebrities benefit from rent controls meant for the poor. We usually only find out about them after they've been exposed. Supermodel Kim Alexis lived under rent protection. So did singer Carly Simon and fashion designer Arnold Scaasi. When he put his apartment in Architectural Digest, he didn't mention he was getting a rent break meant for the needy. We've been trying for weeks to get inside a wealthy person's rent-controlled apartment with our cameras, but it's virtually impossible. People just laughed and said, no way. But we can show you Mia Farrow's old rent-controlled apartment because Woody Allen shot the movie Hannah and Her Sisters here, a third of what you and I would have to pay on the open market. Bad enough that controls let rich insiders get special deals, but the bigger unintended consequence of the laws is that houses and apartments left on the free market cost more. Newcomers pay inflated rents because cities with rent control tend to have less housing. Where there's rent control, landlords don't want to build. In unregulated cities like Dallas and Chicago, lots of apartments are available. But in rent-controlled cities like New York, you may have to bribe someone to get an apartment.
You can pay brokers under the table sometimes, which helps.
But we would never do that.
I would never do that.
Finally, the most destructive unintended consequence of rent controls is that some landlords say, if I can't raise the rent, I won't make repairs. And they don't.
Short of aerial bombardment, the best way to destroy a city is through rent controls.
Rent control is a big reason many landlords abandon their buildings, just walk away from their investment. You see acres of it here in New York. All this has led some opinion makers to have doubts and led some politicians to question the wisdom of what they had done. 2 years ago, Massachusetts decided to end rent control.
People are building housing now in Boston for the first time in 20 years.
Author William Tucker, who wrote this book about housing policy, says it turned out that only 6% of the people getting rent protection in Massachusetts were poor. Those people are now getting subsidies.
It would be a very easy thing to subsidize all the people in any city that need a little help in paying their rent. But instead you impose this blanket system that ruins the housing market, benefits all kinds of people who don't need it, and then you say, oh, we've got a housing crisis.
And that's what we have in New York City and other places where rents are still protected. While the privileged, the insiders, those who know how to work the system, get to freeload. And that's how it usually works.
So what did y'all think about that? Any opinion about it one way or the other? Too early to think about price ceilings. So, as he mentioned there, people who need assistance could be assisted through subsidies that didn't destroy the housing market. So, a lot of the people you looked at in the video, did they really need I think they could probably manage it without government assistance on the price, probably. So that's price, ceilings, again, what is the real issue with that? Now, look at this market and have a demand curve, which tells us the value of the buyer. Have a supply curve, tells us the cost of putting it on profit. The seller, if the seller is willing to sell it for, that's not potency. There we go. And so we have this equilibrium price right here. And have an equilibrium quantity right here. And at that point, you can see that the value is equal to the cost, isn't it? All the consumer surplus and producer surplus that it's possible to have, those have been achieved. But what if we put a price ceiling in here? Right there. This is all the supply that you're going to have right there. If you look over here, does the value still exceed the cost? Yep, the value still exceeds the cost. So what's that mean? Well, it means you've got people willing to buy, you've got people willing to sell. They would all, they'd all be willing to pay for supply, whichever the case may be. But can they purchase what they want to buy? Nope. Who said no? Government told them no, you can't buy what you want to buy. So, is that economic freedom? Not really. Government, although you wanted to buy something and somebody wanted to sell it to you, government told you no. So, you'd be hard pressed to find an economist that supports those. What's the next item here? Well, it's price floors. And the graph looks very similar. It's just the top side of the graph that we'll be dealing with instead of the bottom side. So here we have this market. Looks like a regular supply and demand curve. We've got this equilibrium price here and this quantity right there. But what's happened here, some producer was not happy with the price that the market was bringing them. And so they go to their congressman. I need help. The free market out there is just really hard on me, and I can't make it. So I need your help. I need you to establish a floor underneath of my price. And so they do that. Here's the price floor right here. Why do we call it a floor even though it's in the top part of the graph? Well, the price has to stay above that point. When it hits the floor, it stops. Just like when we stand on this floor, even if you're in a two-story building, when you're standing on the second floor, it stops you from falling through to the first floor, right? So this is a price floor here in the upper part of the graph. So I'm sure that the congressman was well-intentioned when he passed this. He was trying to help a producer. But what about the consumer? Yeah, the consumer is paying a higher price now, right? What would have been piece of bow here if you had left it up to the market. But you didn't. You put it in this price floor. So now the price is up here at piece of 1. And instead of having exactly the proper quantity, do you have the proper quantity anymore? Well, no. You have a surplus. All these extra were produced. How many extra? Well, it's this horizontal distance between the supply curve over here, back over here to the demand curve. That many extra were produced at that price. People are not willing to buy that many at that price. So there's different ways of handling this, but sometimes the government just goes in and makes these purchases. And so not only does the consumer lose out with higher prices, but if the government goes in and makes those purchases, whose money do they use to do that? Yeah, they're using the taxpayers' money, aren't they? They're using your money to go in and buy those for you. Even though if you look at a graph of supply and demand, why didn't you buy those for yourself? Well, because this tells you the cost. This tells you the value. And the reason you didn't buy that quantity yourself at that price is because the cost is greater than the value. And I suspect most of you are pretty rational consumers. If you think something's worth $8, would you pay 10? No. But that's what's going on here. And your government is buying those for you, even though the cost exceeds the value. So is that rational? No. So how do you have this go on? Well, the government got involved in it. Consumers left on their own, generally rational. If they think something's worth only $10, that's all they're going to pay for it. They're not going to pay $12, are they? No, they're not going to pay more than what they think it's worth. And so, when's the only time this is likely to go on? Well, when the government gets involved and puts a floor into place. So let's take a look at a video that shows you some examples of when we have these price floors.
Every year, politicians warn, if we want to guarantee America's food supply, we have to save the family farm. And to do that, they want your money. Lawmakers in Washington have passed a new farm bill. In 2008, Congress passed another $300 billion farm bill.
We cannot turn back, not with an economy to fix and farms to save.
Saving farms is what politicians promise that farm supports will do.
Now, how old is this kid?
It's the reason they do photo ops like this one. The president wouldn't talk to us about the farm bill. We contacted 69 members of Congress who voted for it, but couldn't get any of them to talk to us until finally Randy Cool of New York and Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas agreed to speak.
Family farms, small farms are important.
And I don't think we want anybody in this country to starve. People would starve. They go out of business, and they'd be forced to move elsewhere and find different jobs.
Well, that's not starving. That's finding a different job.
But if they don't have a job, then they're going to starve.
Well, they're doing pretty well in Nebraska. Corn farmer Mike Korth gets subsidies. He'll take the money, he says, but he's against the farm bill.
It's a bad bill. In the end, if you take a bunch of money, it's like they grab the treasure chest, they open the door on it, and whoever can get the most out of it, you just run away with it.
Nebraska farmers are running away with a lot of your money. Home prices may have been falling in most of America, but farmland prices have been rising. Here they've shot up 77% in 4 years. Farm subsidies rarely go to poor people. The average farmer makes twice what the average American earns. Yet Nebraska politicians want more.
We need to get farmers a better safety net here.
If you're a politician from Nebraska and you want to get elected, Republican or Democrat, the way to do that is to say, I support farm subsidy.
Yes, that's a very important thing to our farmer is a subsidy.
They would lose dramatic population if the subsidies weren't there at all.
But despite the billions spent on subsidies, farm towns are smaller than ever. In Mike Korth's town, store after store is boarded up.
It's pretty sad. The school at one time had just short of 1,000 kids in it, and now we don't have 300.
It hasn't kept these small towns alive.
Well, I think it has. I'm from a small town of 72 people. I am, and I'm going to tell you, farm subsidies have helped that town.
After this interview, we researched his town. It was twice as big during the Depression. Population has dropped steadily ever since.
But this isn't working. Well, I think it is.
And more. You guys are on welfare.
It's not working. Actually, I disagree with that because I think it is working.
Actually, a government study found that the more farm aid a county got, the more likely it was to lose population. Why would that be? Because subsidies make it harder for smaller farmers to compete. Economist Walter Williams.
The farm subsidies go to very, very wealthy farmers, not the ma and pa farm. It's these huge agribusinesses that get the big subsidies.
Farmers like Maurice Wilder. He's been America's single biggest recipient of farm subsidies. He wouldn't let us take a picture of his jet, but here he is at one of his many homes. Wilder's estimated to be worth $500 million, but he still gets your help making ends meet.
Where is the limit where you say, you know what, you're big enough now, you can put your pants on by yourself?
How do rich farmers legally get subsidies? The Farm Bill does say no payments to farmers who make more than $1.25 million a year.
Yeah, and I can guarantee you, any one of them guys, they've got accountants that can hide that income.
When you have a farm bill this size, this stretches almost 2 football fields. There are loopholes in here somewhere for a wealthy farmer to crawl through.
I don't blame anybody from taking it when it's there and available.
You're getting a handout. Well, they're getting, in a sense, it is a handout.
This is not a handout. Take it, and if you lose it, fine, walk away. Not at all.
It's not?
No, it's not.
Why isn't that a handout?
I don't term it a handout. I term it an investment.
But that's your money he's investing. And why? We don't need farm subsidies to have an ample food supply. I bet you didn't know that the growers of most crops don't get subsidies. Growers of apples, bananas, broccoli, cabbage, cantaloupe, carrots, cauliflower, grapes, lemons, limes, lettuce, and dozens of other crops get no subsidies. There's no cabbage crisis or pineapple panic. And yet, because big crops get subsidies like rice and corn, food costs more.
I'm not used to paying these prices.
Another reason prices are high is that farmers get paid for not farming.
You get a government payment on it, about $26,000.
More than $20,000 a year for not farming his land. The real estate agents even use farm payments to sell homes to non-farmers. Agents didn't want to say that on television, so our producer posed as a home buyer and brought along a video camera.
Do you have to farm it? Do you have to farm it to receive it? No. It's like a little bonus that you don't really have to do anything to get.
All these homes get government payments, though nothing's farmed here. The owner of this home collected $7,000.
Well, it's like offered to us.
She isn't exactly sure why.
I think it's a weird setup, but there's a lot of weird setup.
This is just a crazy system. It's left over from the 1930s, left over from the Depression, and it's a great example of how nothing is as permanent as a temporary government program.
Of course, it is true that without subsidies, some bureaucrats would be out of work, and some farms would go out of business. But that's okay, say economists. It's part of the creative destruction that makes America strong.
When there's progress, certain jobs are destroyed and certain jobs are created. The guy who delivered ice to my house, he doesn't have a job because we have refrigerators. We're better off. Now, the guy who lost his job selling ice, he probably got some other job. But we would have been held back if we had tried to save his job.
But today in America, politicians are eager to spend your money to keep certain auto companies afloat.
Loan guarantees that we've already passed for our auto industry.
Certain banks in business.
We must pass legislation to address this crisis.
And to keep farms from closing.
I think we might have to get 2 or 3 of these, don't you think?
Yeah. There is one country that has abolished farm subsidy, New Zealand. There were riots and protests when they did that. Farmers said, we'll go bankrupt. people said, we'll starve. But it didn't happen. In fact, farm productivity quintupled.
Agriculture there has boomed once they got people off the dole. Instead of sucking up to you politicians, they found ways to be more efficient as farmers.
I don't have many farmers sucking up. I do have them coming in and thanking me for allowing their family farm to survive.
Clothing and shelter are important too. Why don't we subsidize them? If this works so well, why don't we just subsidize everything?
Well, I would say to you that you don't.
So what did y'all think of that one?
Government needs to let the market be the market.
Yeah, government needs to let the market do what it does. Again, when you have the price floor, you've got the situation where, you know, you're not producing at a point where the cost is equal to the value, which is irrational. So, what are some other things in this chapter? The impact of a tax, and what you'll see if you look at that in Exhibit 5 and 6 is if you put a tax on something, it doesn't matter whether you tax the buyer or if you tax the seller. Now, from looking at the graph, you're able to determine the amount of the tax and if it's a tax on the buyer or if it's a tax on the seller. Now, if you put a tax on a seller, what's he do to the supply? Yeah, he lowers the supply. He reduces the supply in order to try to recover that cost, right? He's not just going to gladly take that out of his profits. He's going to try to pass that along to the consumer. How does he do that? Well, he just does it by decreasing the supply, right? So, this vertical distance that the supply curve moves, that's the amount of the tax. So, in this case, it's $1,000 from $6,400 up to $7,400. That's this vertical distance right here. So, some wise politician may have said, well, that didn't work out. Why don't we tax the buyer instead? People, when it comes to economics, even if they can't draw these graphs, they're generally pretty rational. So, do buyers notice this tax? Yeah, they notice the tax, don't they? And what do? They buy less, don't they? Which equates to a decrease in supply, right? Or decrease in demand, right? So, we have this decrease in demand. How much is it? What's the amount of tax? It's this vertical distance here, which is still $1,000. Did anything change other than now the demand curve shifted instead of the supply curve? No, nothing changed. It's pretty hard to fool people when it comes to economics. Like I say, even if they can't draw all of these graphs, I might have told you before the Milton Friedman's example of a pool player. There's a pool player and a physics professor. There's this really complex pool shot to be made. Or you could use golf as an example too, couldn't you? A lot of physics behind exactly how much force it's going to take and the exact trajectory that this is all going to happen. The physics professor calculates all that. He works out all the equations. But when it actually comes to making the shot, are you going to bet on the pool player or if it's golf, the golfer? Now, they're more likely to make the shot even though they don't understand all the physics, right? So it's the same way with markets. Even if somebody can't draw these graphs, do they still know if they're getting taxed $1,000 and respond appropriately? Yeah, you can figure that out pretty easily, can't you? So, how much of the tax is going to be paid by the consumer and how much by the producer? Well, it depends on the slopes of the supply and demand curves. If you look at Exhibit 7, first example here, there's a tax, and the demand curve is really steep right there. The supplier was able to pass along that pretty easily a price increase with it. On the other hand, what if it's more elastic? What if you have this flat demand curve? Is the consumer able to pass along that tax very easily? Not really. Pretty hard to increase his price, isn't it? Why? The demand curve is pretty flat here. This chapter also talks about taxes, progressive, proportional, and regressive taxes. What are the differences? Well, a progressive tax, it tells you on page 83, it's a tax in which the average tax rate rises with income. People with higher incomes will pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes. So can anybody think of an example of that? No? Anybody been working on filing their taxes lately? Income taxes? Some of you have? Yeah. And the more money you make, what happens to the rate that you have to pay? Yeah, it gets higher and higher the more money you make, right? So what kind of tax is that? Well, it's a progressive tax. People with higher incomes pay a higher rate in income tax. Proportional tax, a tax in which the average tax rate is the same at all income levels. Everyone pays the same percentage of income in taxes. Anybody know an example of that? Yeah, Medicare tax, right? Anybody work? Some of you, yeah. And that's something that comes out of your paycheck as a payroll tax, right? Yeah. So, you know what rate you pay?
I don't know what rate
you pay Medicare tax, yeah. 1.45%. And it doesn't matter how much income you have, you're always paying 1.45%. So that's a proportional tax. Regressive tax, a tax in which the average tax rate falls with income. People with higher incomes will pay a lower percentage of their income in taxes. So what might be a few examples of that? A sales tax. Now, we're all paying at the same rate in sales tax, so why would that be regressive? Yep, that's exactly right. Poorer people spend a higher percentage of their income on taxable items, right? And so if you're not that wealthy, you probably spend a large percentage of your income at the grocery store and, you know, stores like Walmart and things like that. You spend a lot of your income there. But if you look at a billionaire, does he spend a large percentage of his earnings at the grocery store and Walmart? No. He's usually not buying items that are taxable. He's investing the money in things like that. And so it winds up, even though the rate is the same for everybody, people with less income, they purchase, they spend a larger percentage of their income on taxable items. So they wind up paying the tax at a higher rate. What's another one? It's another one of your payroll taxes. Yeah, your Social Security tax, right? Anybody know that rate? Yeah. Yeah, it's a little over 6%. I think it's 6.2 if I remember right. I think it's 6.2%, but it's up to around. It's a little over $100,000. They changed that limit occasionally, so I don't always keep up with it, but it's a little over $100,000, around 110,000 or so. And if you make up to that, you pay at the 6.2%. But what if you make $1 million? Well, you only paid up to that $110,000 or so, roughly. After that, you don't owe anymore. So what happens to the average tax rate for that person that makes the $1 million? Yeah, the average tax rate goes down. So on the other side of that, some people say that and say it's terrible. On the flip side of that, what are they going to try to argue if you try to eliminate that cap? When they draw Social Security, is there also a maximum amount that they're going to be paid? Yeah. You hadn't heard of any wealthy people getting $500,000 checks out of the Social Security system, have you? No. I don't know what it is, but it's several $1,000s a month, and that's all you're ever going to draw in Social Security, regardless of how many millions you might have paid in, right? So, in defense of it, there's a cap on the return side also. So, but you've probably heard the Social Security system is in trouble, and I suspect that might be one of the fixes is to raise or eliminate that cap. So, and like I say, you could argue on both sides of that argument as to why that should be in place. So, the Laufer curve, this is something that Art Laufer came up with back in the 80s, I believe. He was a supply-side economist. President Reagan was particularly fond of supply-side economists, and I'll show you why. What we have here is this Laufer curve, and it shows the maximum amount of tax revenue that the government might collect. And intuitively, you might just think that, well, the higher the rate, the more tax the government's going to collect. But let's talk about that. At a rate of 0, what are they going to collect? Multiply income by 0, you get what? Your 0. So obviously, they're not going to collect anything. So you might just say, well, the higher the rate, the more revenue is going to be collected. But if you think about that, what if they taxed all of your income? Would you work? No. I wouldn't be here today if the government was taxing 100% of my income. I could probably find something else to do, right? Probably be working somewhere illegally where the government wasn't collecting the taxes, right? You ever heard of people that work in some professions? They, especially maybe on construction sites or something, there's people working out there that aren't paying taxes, and it's not all being reported. Lots of people would be doing that kind of work, wouldn't they? Why? Well, it'd be the only way to make a living, right? So, at 100% tax rate, the government's not likely to collect much revenue because most people would not be working, at least in jobs that were being reported, right? So, we know that at 0, they collect no revenue. At 100%, they collect next to no revenue. There may be some people that would prefer working to watching soap operas or something, but a lot of people wouldn't. So, we know that these two places is near 0, so somewhere in between these, you can't see that, somewhere in between these, there's going to be some maximum amount of revenue that the government's likely to collect, and then it's going to turn back this way. arbitrarily drawn in there where it's exactly 50% is the peak. Nobody knows where that is. I suspect that it's down somewhere lower than 50%, maybe 35%, 40%. Just nobody knows the exact number. Just think about yourself, though. At some point, you're going to lose incentive to work if the government's taking too much from you, right? So, why did President Reagan in particular listen to the supply-siders? Well, what did he do before he was president? He did several things, but anybody ever seen a movie with him in it? Maybe Bedtime for Bonzo. That was a really good one. I like that movie. Ever seen that movie? Yeah, that was a pretty good movie. Old black and white movie, so it's pretty good if you haven't seen it. But he was a movie actor, right? Well, they made movies a lot faster back then, and he could make several movies in a year, but anybody know the maximum tax bracket back when he was making movies? Yeah, it was about 90%, roughly 90%. So, turns out he could make 2 movies a year before he got into that 90% tax bracket. So guess how many movies a year he made? 2. If he made a third one, the government takes 90% of it. So, if he gave 10% at church, he doesn't get anything, right? So, right? So, I don't know if he did or not, but if he did, he wouldn't get anything. So, did he make one of those? No. He went home to his ranch up in Northern California and waited until the government told him they'd let him make another movie. Of course, they'd let him make another movie, but he wouldn't receive any earnings from it. So is there any incentive for him to make another movie? No. No incentive there. And so he certainly realized, that there was an issue with incentives. And so he was fond of the supply-siders because he could relate to that. There's one more video that we're going to watch. It's a short video, like 4 minutes, and then we'll talk about it for a minute and wrap this up. Here we go.
Is price gouging evil? Everyone agrees that if a seller greedily doubles prices after, say, a hurricane, that's not only bad, it's immoral. People say that when gas prices are raised.
And they're taking advantage of it. I think we're being ripped off.
We are being hosed here, and the oil fat cats are lapping up the dollar. Gouging at its best.
But what exactly is gouging? People say it's raising prices too much, but who exactly gets to decide what's too much?
For people to take advantage of those in need violates every biblical standard of morals that I'm aware of.
Mississippi's Attorney General announced a crackdown on gougers after Hurricane Katrina.
There's massive destruction everywhere.
One gouger who was arrested was John Shepperson. He and his family live in Kentucky. They watched news reports about Katrina and learned people desperately needed things.
My wife just got out of the hospital, and she's very sick, and we need a generator.
John thought he could help and make some money, too, so he bought 19 generators, and he and his family then rented a U-Haul and drove it 600 miles to this part of Mississippi, which had no power at the time.
5 million people in this region are without power.
John offered to sell his generators for twice what he'd paid for them, and people were eager to buy.
People were excited. We had a product they needed.
But instead, police confiscated his generators, and John was locked up in this jail for price gouging.
They arrested me, and I just could not believe that I was being arrested.
Authorities held him 4 days, and his generators are still in police custody.
And then nobody got any use out of them. They were useless.
So did the public benefit? The real question is, what's the best way to deal with shortages after a disaster?
Anybody, what do we need? Come on, guys. Generators. Food.
Anytime there's a natural disaster, a hurricane, an earthquake, the price of the things that people desperately want to have, batteries, flashlights, generators, water, milk, they go up or they disappear.
Economist Russ Roberts points out that after the disaster, if sellers don't raise prices, supplies vanish. Anxious buyers line up and often buy more than they need just in case. Those not at the front of the line may get nothing.
More people want to buy it than there is stuff available. So what do you do? How do you solve that problem? How do you find out who should get those scarce items?
A major energy crisis.
During the last energy crisis, the politician's solution was to cap prices. But that didn't fix the problem. It made it worse.
It was a disaster. It led to long lines, and you couldn't get gasoline.
That's why today's high oil profits, says Roberts, are a good thing, because they're a huge incentive to oil companies to look for more oil.
You want them to make these monster profits?
I do. Higher prices are hard on consumers. Hard on consumers today, good for consumers tomorrow when those high prices give energy companies the incentive to go discover and refine more energy in the future.
Which is why what the politicians call gouging is actually good. Now, I know you don't believe that.
That's absurd. It's absurd. Prove it. I mean, prove it.
I don't know what Mr. Stossel was thinking.
Okay, you probably won't believe me or economist Roberts, but would you believe 3 Nobel Prize-winning economists, all of whom say gouging is good and the best way to get supplies to people who need them most?
Fair is the best way to do that, and that's a good thing.
The gougers deserve a medal.
Because the higher prices bring in the goods that people desperately need.
We don't let the price rise, there aren't going to be enough generators to go around. We let the price rise, we give people an incentive to bring them in.
Somebody needs to bring these products to people when there are disasters and emergencies, and this is going to be one person that's not going to be there that they took out of the equation.
Economists we talk to say he's a hero. You're the one who's immoral for saying he can't sell generators to people who want willingly to pay for them.
Look, my job is to enforce the law. Our laws state that you cannot increase your profits once a state of emergency has been declared.
People want to live in a world where love is what motivates people to help others, and love does that. But there isn't enough love to go around. Love for strangers isn't going to motivate enough people to get in their trucks, load them up with generators, and take them down to help people who are cold and hungry.
So, what do y'all think about that? Is it ethical to raise prices after a natural disaster? Depends on the situation. And you saw differing opinions there. You saw some of them that said, that's absolutely unethical, and the other side is prices, a rationing mechanism. If you don't don't have a limit to how many people can purchase, the first ones in line are probably going to purchase all of them because you're selling them below the market price. Yeah, then they'll probably go sell them for a higher price. So, they'll sell them for whatever the market will bear. So, what about the guy that brought generators down there? People were wanting generators. He loaded up generators and hauled them down there, wound up in jail for selling them at a profit, even though there were people willing to pay for the generators. But was that ethical for him to do that, or? Yeah. So that's what supply and demand tells you, right? If they weren't willing to buy it, at this price, it price up here, a high price, well, at that price is where they're willing to buy it. If they're not willing to buy it, they'd have to drop the price, right?
Even then, they would have to buy it because they're completely out of power, and the whole area is out of power, so therefore there's a significant need for it.
Right. But at some point, they're not going to be willing to buy it because people lived without electricity for thousands of years, didn't they? So, yeah, at some point it becomes too expensive and they won't buy it, right? So, yeah, you're right, they have a tremendous need for it, didn't they? Ethics is one of those things that, you know, you have to decide for yourself if it's right or wrong, don't you? You have to have some way of rationing if the supply is low. Now, some businesses, you know, they may not, even if they're allowed to raise the price, they may not raise the price because, you know, they don't want bad publicity for doing so. So different stores handle these shortages in different ways. You see that even when it's not a natural disaster. Has anybody tried to purchase any 22 shells lately? Yeah. The way a lot of stores are handling it, Walmart, for example, they'll sell you 2 boxes of them at a time if they have them. But did they raise the price of them? No. Price is the same as it's always been. Now, could they get more for them if they raised the price? Yeah, they could get more for them, but would they maybe get bad publicity for that? Yeah, they don't want to deal with the publicity, and so they choose to normally be sold out. And they put a limit on how many one person can buy so that one person's not buying them all. There's a gun store in Dallas that I go to. They always have 22 shells available. It's $10 for a box of 50 last time I was down there. And those weren't even good shells. They were lead shells. So they choose to handle it differently, though. They know that their customers may need those, so they charge a price high enough so that it rations the supply that they have so that they're not sold out all the time. So it's just a rationing mechanism, and some people have different views on, you know, how that should be done than others. So nothing right or wrong with any of them, unless you feel that it's right or wrong. I can't tell you what's right and wrong. You have to make that decision for yourself, right? So